There are stories in history so grotesque that even medieval scribes hesitated to write them down. And this is one of them, the tale of a king celebrated as a hero, praised as a savior of England, a man whose statue now stands in clean marble, but who once sat, day after day, on a throne carved like a toilet, dripping blood through a wooden hole while servants shuffled beneath him to catch whatever leaked from his rotting flesh. This king did not wither after battle, nor was he poisoned by rivals, nor cursed by witches. He was destroyed by something modern medicine could fix in an afternoon. Yet in his time it turned him into a living corpse, who ruled while his body decayed like a dying animal trapped inside royal robes. And the darkest truth is this: England's greatest king spent the final decades of his reign quite literally decomposing. It begins in the year 849, when Alfred was born into a world where wealth tasted like roasted meat dripping with fat, where vegetables were mocked as food for peasants, where the royal table was a battlefield of excess, each meal pushing his young body closer to a quiet disaster. For years, the warning signs simmered beneath the surface, ignored, minimized, swallowed under feasts and ale. Then came the moment that changed England forever. In the year 868, 19-year-old Alfred tried to prove his strength in a stone-lifting competition, the kind of brutal pastime nobles used to show off their muscles and ego. He lifted a stone, weighing nearly 200 pounds, strained harder than his body could bear, and something deep inside him tore open with a pain so sharp he collapsed immediately. Blood soaked through his clothes. The king-to-be had ruptured and prolapsed internal hemorrhoids, though no one at the time knew what that meant. What they did know was that he could no longer sit, no longer ride, no longer relieve himself without agony that made him scream into pillows so the court wouldn't hear. Medieval physicians, armed with herbs, leeches, hotirons, and desperation, treated him the only way they knew how, with remedies that hurt far more than they healed. They burned him. They bled him. They smeared pastes on torn flesh. They prayed over him. Nothing worked. The young prince became a man whose life revolved around pain. Each time he sat, the damaged tissue tore further. Each bowel movement became an event of blood and shaking and silent humiliation. And just when he should have been recovering, fate hit him with the cruelest blow yet in the year 871. His brother died in battle, and Alfred, only 22 years old, bleeding daily, became King of Wessex. That was the moment the private agony of a young man became the hidden crisis of a kingdom. Alfred could not ride into battle because the saddle crushed his swollen, torn flesh until blood ran down his legs. He could not stand through long councils without trembling. He could not sit for more than a few minutes before pain blurred his vision. Yet he was a king, and a king must sit, a king must lead, a king must be seen. So his court did something unthinkable. They crafted a new throne, one that looked regal from a distance, but had a large hole carved through the center, beneath which servants waited with bowls, cloths, herbs, and the grim duty of cleaning whatever dripped from their monarch. By the year 875, the toilet throne had become the true seat of English power. From that moment, the rule of England took place in a claustrophobic chamber that smelled of incense failing to hide blood, rot, and human waste. Diplomats entered with stiff smiles, pretending not to notice the odor clinging to the air. Soldiers bowed while servants crawled under the king's legs to replace brimming chamber pots. Alfred held court while pus seeped from tissue that never healed, while the pain distorted his focus, while his dignity clung to him by a thread, fragile enough to snap at any moment. Viking invaders mocked him in crude songs, calling him the king who cannot sit, the king who fights from a toilet, turning his private torment into public humiliation. But they did not know the terrifying truth. Alfred's mind grew sharper as his body decayed, as if pain itself carved away weakness, leaving something cold and relentless behind. He strategized through agony, planned fortifications while bleeding, outmaneuvered warriors who mocked him, all while sitting above a bowl meant for catching blood. Then came the darkest chapter of all. In the year 878, when Vikings drove him into the marshes of Somerset, Alfred was forced to live without his modified throne, without his attendants, without herbs or cloths to manage the continuous bleeding. The infections spread rapidly. His flesh swelled, split, and rotted. The smell became so unbearable that some of his men abandoned him. Yet he survived. And not only survived, he returned to lead a counterattack that changed the fate of England forever. History praises this victory as divine providence. But the true miracle is that he fought it all while his body deteriorated with every heartbeat. The final years of his life turned into an unending descent. Flesh around the injury turned necrotic. His body oozed constantly. He sat on his toilet throne through councils, meals, treaties, and prayers because there was no other way to function. When he finally died in the year 899, it was not on a battlefield but in the same position he had ruled from for decades, sitting above a chamber pot while infection consumed him from the inside. The instant he died, his court destroyed the throne, dismissed the servants who knew the truth, and rewrote his story to erase the stench, the shame, the unbearable humanity of his suffering. They rebuilt him as a legend, Alfred the Great, the Scholar King, the Saviour of England. But beneath every polished sentence in those chronicles lies the truth. They tried to bury the kingdom was held together by a man who ruled while decomposing alive. This is the story they tried to hide. And in the next parts, we will sink deeper into the nightmare, how a royal court functioned around the smell of rot, how servants lived with tasks no human should endure, how a king's mind sharpened while his flesh failed, and how a nation's fate rested on a man who sat not on a throne of glory, but on a hole carved for survival. In the dim afterglow of that first revelation, the story drifts into a quieter, darker current, the kind that moves slowly but never loosens its grip. And it's here that the weight of Alfred's existence begins to settle over him like a damp shroud. Pain had already become his daily companion. But by the time the modified throne became his permanent seat, the pain evolved into something more complicated. Something that lived beneath his skin, like a trapped animal, scratching endlessly to escape. There were mornings when he woke before dawn, not because duty called him, but because the throbbing deep inside him pulsed like a second heartbeat, steady and merciless, reminding him that even the first breath of a new day was already burdened. He would sit upright in bed, knees drawn slightly inward, praying silently, not for strength, not for victory, not for divine guidance, but for the simplest mercy a king could desire: just 1 hour without suffering. One moment where the flesh between his body and the throne did not feel like it was tearing itself open. And even in those private prayers, he felt foolish, because he knew that asking for freedom from pain was like asking the sun to rise in the west, a request too far outside the world's design to ever come true. As his condition worsened, Alfred began rearranging his life around narrow windows of tolerable discomfort, planning counsels for moments when the pressure inside him eased slightly, even if only by a margin. His physicians tried to understand these rhythms, watching the way his face tightened or relaxed, learning to predict when a meeting had to end even before he signaled it, because the pain in his eyes would suddenly sharpen like a blade drawn in silence. They learned the language of his suffering the way other men learned Latin, discerning every nuance, every wince, every breath cut a little too short. And in turn, Alfred learned to mask his agony, to control the trembling in his hands, to steady his voice with a discipline that soldiers respected more than any triumphant speech. But the mask always had cracks, and only those closest to him saw how often he had to pause mid-sentence to shift his weight. How many times a counselor pretended to adjust a scroll just to give the king a few moments to breathe through a spike of pain. Life around the throne evolved into a ritual of silent cooperation. Servants moved like shadows, relying on timing instead of words. Waiting for the precise moment, Alfred lifted the slightest fraction of his weight so they could slip a chamber pot out and replace it with another. They grew so skilled at their work that they could do it without making a sound. Each movement as coordinated as dancers in a grim ballet, no one would ever applaud. And Alfred, for all his pride, could not help feeling gratitude for the quiet dignity they offered him, for the way they never met his eyes, during the most humiliating moments, for the way they pretended not to notice when fresh blood hit the bottom of the pot with a soft, betraying splash. Yet there were nights when gratitude could not drown the shame. Nights when Alfred dismissed them early just so he could sit alone. Elbows on knees, forehead pressed into his palms, letting the silence swallow him whole. Those nights were the ones that frightened him most, because in the absence of tasks and noise and motion, the pain expanded into a kind of monstrous presence that filled the room and pressed against his skull. A reminder that he was slowly rotting in a chamber built to hide that very truth. Even the castle itself began to change as the months passed. The hallways near the council room were washed with stronger herbs, the kind usually reserved for plague victims, and torches burned hotter to disguise the smell that seeped from beneath the throne room door. Guards stationed outside learned to breathe shallowly, inhaling through cloths soaked in lavender or mint, though even those tricks were never enough by sunset. Visitors adjusted their cloaks before entering, steeling themselves for the strange cocktail of incense. Sweat, rot, and something metallic that clung to the air like a ghost. Some pretended not to notice. Others faltered mid-bow, but none dared speak of it, because acknowledging the smell meant acknowledging the truth, and the truth carried consequences. No diplomat or noble wanted to risk. Inside the chamber, the king's world shrank. Hours blurred into one another, the throne anchoring every moment of his existence. The wooden edges worn smooth from constant shifting. The cushion beneath him flattened slowly over time, molded to the shape of his suffering, until the craftsmen were called to add more padding. They did so quietly, as if modifying a throne to catch blood was a normal request from a monarch. Alfred watched all of this with a strange mixture of detachment and self-preservation, knowing he needed the throne but hating the fact that he needed it, understanding that without it he would collapse, but wishing more than anything that he could simply sit like other men. He longed for the simple solidity of a normal seat, the comforting certainty of wood under his weight instead of empty space, designed to spare broken flesh. Yet every time he imagined sitting elsewhere, even in his mind, he could feel the tearing sensation flare again. And he knew the wooden hole beneath him was the only thing standing between him and unspeakable agony. Daily life became a negotiation between pain and responsibility. There were days when Alfred felt strong enough to argue with his counselors, to debate military formations or discuss legal reforms, speaking with the clarity and sharpness that made him respected even among rivals. And there were days when he barely whispered orders, when the ache inside him spread upward like a fever, making his vision blur at the edges, making the air feel thick and heavy in his lungs. On those days, he held onto the arms of the throne until his knuckles whitened, praying that no one would notice the slight tremor that ran through his body. But the people closest to him always noticed, and though none dared speak it aloud, they carried a quiet dread that the king might collapse right in front of them. The fear grew each time he paused mid-sentence. each time his jaw clenched long enough for the veins in his neck to rise. Each time they saw him swallow the taste of blood that sometimes rose in the back of his throat when his body strained too hard. Even time itself seemed to change inside that room. Hours felt stretched thin, as if the very air moved sluggishly, and Alfred found himself counting his life not in days or years but in moments between attacks of pain. Moments of rare steadiness when his thoughts could settle long enough for him to plan the kingdom's future. He trained himself to think faster because he never knew how long clarity would last. Every idea had to be shaped, tested, and spoken before the next wave of agony rolled through him. This urgency gave his rule a strange intensity, a kind of desperate brilliance that pushed him to work harder than any king before him. Not out of ambition, but out of necessity. His body forced him to seize every scrap of usefulness before suffering returned. And in doing so, it sharpened him into something remarkable, something almost unnatural, a mind racing against a dying body, determined to outrun decay for as long as he could. And while the world outside saw a kingdom fighting off invaders, a nation rising from chaos, a monarch shaping law and culture, only those inside that small dim chamber knew the truth. England was being held together by a man who could not sit on anything but a wooden hole. A man who clenched his jaw through every council. A man whose endurance bordered on the inhuman. They saw the tremors he tried to hide, the blood he pretended not to feel, the quiet despair that flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. But they also saw the fire inside him, the will that refused to break, the strange strength that grew from the very suffering trying to consume him. And in that contradiction, rotting flesh paired with unyielding determination lay the true shape of Alfred's reign, a shape the world would never fully understand. The deeper the story sinks, the more the world around Alfred begins to warp under the weight of his condition. And by the time the third chapter of his ordeal unfolds, the throne room has transformed into something closer to a sanctuary for suffering than a chamber of power. The air inside is always warm, thick with the burn of torches, and the sweeter, cloying scent of herbs meant to soothe wounds that never healed. And sometimes the king wonders if he still smells the world outside at all, or if his senses have slowly adapted to the endless mixture of incense, blood, and rot, until it became the only atmosphere he could breathe. Yet even in that suffocating space, life continued to move around him. People entering and leaving with carefully curated expressions, pretending that everything was normal, while the truth hung between them like a silent shadow clinging to every corner of the room. Alfred could feel those lies pressing against him more strongly, each passing month, could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts filling the chamber, the way fog fills a valley at dawn, slow and steady and inevitable. What changed most profoundly during this period was Alfred's relationship with silence. It used to be a comfort, a brief respite between councils, a moment in which he could gather his thoughts without interruption. But now silence had become something different, something alive and watchful, something that crawled along the edges of his awareness. It was in the way the servants refused to speak unless spoken to, their quiet footsteps, avoiding even the smallest creak of wood as they moved around him. It was in the way the councillors held their breath whenever he paused mid-sentence, unsure whether the hesitation came from pain or deep thought. It was in the way his own breathing sounded too loud in the stillness, the small, involuntary groans slipping past his teeth whenever a sharper pulse of agony seized him. The silence became not a pause, but a presence, a constant reminder that everyone in the room was pretending, shielding him from the humiliation he already felt crawling through his veins. The psychological toll of that quiet pretense grew steadily, sinking roots into his mind, the way moisture seeps into stone, fracturing it from within. Alfred began to think of himself in two distinct halves, the visible king and the hidden man beneath the robes. The The visible king sat upright, spoke clearly, issued commands with authority. A figure carved by expectation and duty. The hidden man was the one who clenched his teeth so hard they ached, who felt the warm trickle of blood slide slowly along the inside of his thigh, who had to hold perfectly still, because even shifting an inch would ignite fresh torment. He lived in a state of constant separation from himself, forced to divide body and mind, just to survive each day with any semblance of dignity. And while he wore the mask of kingship, well, the cracks beneath it multiplied, small fractures that widened every time he glimpsed his reflection in the polished metal basin servants used to prepare medicinal pastes. The man staring back at him was pale, exhausted, older than his years, and haunted by the knowledge that he would never again inhabit his body without pain. In this period of internal unraveling, Alfred's nights became more perilous than his days. Nighttime stripped away the distractions of councils and duties, leaving him alone with sensations that no longer had to be masked. The darkness amplified every twitch, every throb, every pulse of swelling tissue that refused to heal. Sleep came only in brief fragments, shallow and restless, shattered by spasms that tore him out of dreams before they fully formed. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the low ceiling illuminated by flickering candlelight, listening to his own heartbeat echo through his skull, imagining the swollen flesh beneath him as a small beast gnawing its way outward. And when exhaustion finally forced his eyes closed, he sometimes dreamed of falling into a bottomless well, the descent endless and weightless, until the inevitable bolt of pain jolted him awake again. Those dreams unsettled him because they mirrored his waking life too closely. Each moment spent waiting for the next burst of agony, the next reminder that his body was both his prison and his executioner. Even so, daylight obliged him to rise and rule, and the kingdom demanded his mind even as his body betrayed him. Diplomats arrived with quills and scrolls, seeking alliances or clarifications, their faces polite but strained as they entered the chamber, where the air always tasted faintly metallic. Alfred tried to ignore the way. Some of them shifted subtly to breathe through their mouths, the way their eyes flickered downward whenever a muffled sound drifted from beneath the throne. He learned to speak steadily, even when pain rippled through him. Learned to keep his eyes on theirs, so they would not glance at the servants moving silently behind him. Learned to cloak the trembling of his fingers by holding a scroll or resting a hand on the carved arm of his throne. But despite his efforts, he could feel their pity slipping through the cracks of their diplomacy, an emotion far more humiliating than disdain or fear. Pity meant they saw him as fragile, pitiable, diminished. And though he would never show it, pity was the one thing that scalded his pride more harshly than the pain itself. Meanwhile, the servants closest to him grew into a strange sort of family, bound not by affection, but by routine, necessity, and the grim intimacy of shared suffering. They developed a rhythm that required no words, to a choreography of tending and cleaning and adjusting that could be performed, even if the king drifted momentarily into a state of half-consciousness during the worst waves of agony. Some of them grew protective of him in quiet ways, adjusting the cushions by fractions of an inch, preparing warmer cloths than required, smoothing the folds of his robe to spare him embarrassment. Others built emotional walls so thick that Alfred sometimes wondered if they saw him as a man at all, or merely a task to be performed. A body requiring maintenance like any other piece of palace infrastructure. He could not blame them for either approach. He knew too well that serving him demanded a kind of emotional endurance no one should have had to cultivate. As this inner circle moved through their days, the outside world continued to shake with threats and conflict. Alfred received reports of raids, uprisings, political tensions, all while confined to his throne, unable to ride or walk more than a short distance without risking a fresh cascade of bleeding. His generals grew stronger in his stead. Acting with authority he could no longer physically embody, but always returning for guidance. Knowing that despite the decay consuming his flesh, his mind remained the sharpest weapon the kingdom possessed. That truth sustained him even on the bleakest mornings, offering a reminder that he was still needed, still capable of steering England towards survival, even if he could not lead from horseback. In this way, his suffering forced him to delegate and strategize in ways no king before him had attempted, turning him into something like a commander at the center of a web, pulling threads with meticulous precision while his body remained anchored to the throne. Yet the most profound change of all happened inside Alfred's own understanding of mortality. Pain stripped away the illusions that life was long or predictable. Each day became a fragile victory. Every moment of clarity, a borrowed gift. He began to contemplate the shape of his legacy, not with vanity but with a quiet urgency, aware that his flesh might betray him fully at any moment. In those rare stretches when the pain dulled enough for him to think clearly, he wrote, translated, planned reforms that could outlive him, inscribing ideas onto parchment with the intensity of a man racing against time. He knew his body was rotting. He knew that infection brewed constantly beneath him. Yet he also knew that the kingdom needed him, needed his mind, needed the discipline that suffering carved into him like a sculptor's blade. And so he endured, day after day, night after night, bound to a throne that spared his flesh, even as it reminded him of everything he had lost. The story deepens into a darker corridor as the months continue to grind Alfred down, and by the time this next stretch of his life unfolds, the throne room has taken on an entirely different character. No longer just a place where a king works, but a chamber where the boundary between the living and the decaying feels thin enough to tear. The air hangs heavier now, as if every breath requires wading through the thickness of suffering that clings to the walls. And even the torches seem to burn lower, their flames flickering as though disturbed by a presence that cannot be seen. Alfred senses this change in ways he cannot articulate, feeling as though time itself has slowed around him, congealing into something sticky and difficult to move through. He spends more hours than he can count sitting on his modified throne, not because he wishes to remain rooted there, but because he has no other choice. The moment he tries to stand for longer than a few seconds, the tearing sensation inside him flares with such intensity that it steals the breath from his lungs. And so he remains seated, day after day, the throne becoming both his refuge and his cage. What grows more unbearable during this period is not just the pain, but the sensation of being observed by forces he cannot name. He often feels watched, even when alone, an awareness that creeps up his spine and settles at the base of his skull, as if the walls themselves have learned his suffering and now echo it back to him. The chamber, already heavy with its blend of smoke and rot, begins to feel sentient, holding the memory of every cry he stifled, every drop of blood that touched the wood, every groan he swallowed to maintain his dignity. At times when the pain blurs his vision and the world tilts around him, he swears he sees shapes flickering at the edge of the torchlight. Not ghosts, but impressions of moments repeating themselves like echoes of the past. A servant kneeling to clean the floor appears where no one stands. The faint scrape of a chamber pot echoes even when the room is empty. He blinks, and the visions vanish, leaving him to wonder whether exhaustion and agony have begun carving hallucinations into his waking hours. Yet he cannot afford to give in to fear or madness, for the kingdom still depends on him, and it is precisely during these months that the weight of leadership grows heaviest. Messages arrive more frequently. Urgent reports of disturbances across the land, foreign whispers of invasion, murmurs of discontent among nobles who rarely see their king beyond the confines of his private chamber. Alfred listens to every report with the kind of calm intensity only a man who has learned to harness pain can possess. His mind has grown sharper, even as his body fails him. Every thought honed like a blade forged in fire. The advisors who enter the room often leave feeling shaken, not by the smell or the atmosphere, but by the unyielding resolve they see in the king's eyes. It unnerves them. The way suffering has stripped away hesitation, leaving behind something severe and unbreakable. They understand now that the king's mind has been tempered by agony into something coldly efficient, capable of seeing through excuses and half-truths with frightening clarity. But there is a cost to that intensity, and it shows most clearly in the late hours when the council has ended and the chamber quiets again. Alfred's body shakes uncontrollably after long meetings, tremors running down his arms and hands like aftershocks. He grips the wooden arms of the throne until the veins in his forearms stand rigid beneath his skin, trying to steady himself long enough for the servants to finish their tasks. They work quickly, eyes lowered, sliding fresh herbs beneath him, pressing warm cloths against inflamed flesh, replacing the chamber pot with practiced, wordless precision. Alfred forces himself to remain still, even as fresh bursts of pain ripen within him, like bruises being struck over and over. And though he has lived with this torment for years, there remain moments when he fears he will faint and fall sideways off the throne, with the humiliation of a broken body on full display. Somehow he never does. The strength that keeps him upright seems to come from a place beyond the physical, some stubborn part of his spirit that refuses to collapse no matter how loudly his body begs for release. The nights grow darker as the year rolls on, and with them come new complications that Alfred can no longer ignore. Infections flare more often now, sending fever crawling through his body in waves that leave him drenched in sweat, even as he shivers. There are days when the skin around the injury feels swollen to the point of bursting, the pressure so unbearable that he contemplates what it would feel like to simply tear the damaged flesh away with his own hands. He never would. Of course, the rational part of his mind remains too strong, too disciplined, but the thoughts creep in all the same, whispering possibilities he wishes he could silence. He finds himself rubbing his temples more frequently, trying to push thoughts of despair back into whatever corner of his mind they emerged from, all while forcing himself to speak with clarity when new issues are brought before him. Despite the suffering etched into every hour, Alfred still manages to create moments of astonishing focus, drawing from a reservoir of mental strength that seems endless, even as his body weakens. He spends hours dictating new translations, refining laws, annotating manuscripts with meticulous detail. The scribes sitting before him often forget the grotesque nature of their surroundings because the king's voice commands such authority, his explanations so detailed and lucid that they become lost in the brilliance of his thought. It is only when the king pauses abruptly, hand gripping the arm of the throne as another burst of agony strikes, that they remember where they are, what he endures, and how extraordinary it is that he continues to work at all. Meanwhile, the people closest to him begin to change in ways they do not fully understand. Servants who once approached their tasks with professional detachment now move with a kind of reverent care, as though tending to something sacred, though none of them would dare admit it aloud. Councillors who used to see Alfred as a leader now see him as something more complicated, a man who embodies both decay and resilience, fragility and ferocity. Even generals begin to adopt a quieter tone when speaking to him, to aware that the king they serve is both suffering and transcending that suffering in a way they cannot fully comprehend. They see in him a man who has been carved down to his essence, stripped of physical power and ornament, but left with a mind sharpened into something like legend. The palace itself adapts to the king's condition, embracing new routines that become woven into the fabric of daily life. The guards speak less. The servants whisper more softly. The torches burn longer. The corridor leading to the throne room is cleaned twice as often, though the smell still returns by evening. And though no one says it aloud, everyone senses the presence of strain crawling through the palace. A tension that rises and falls with the king's health, like a tide pulled by an unseen moon. Even the young pages, too inexperienced to understand the full truth, I feel an unease. They cannot name whenever they pass by the heavy wooden door that conceals the king's suffering from public view. What Alfred wrestles with most intensely during this phase is the creeping awareness that the infection within him is slowly winning. The signs are subtle at first. A faint warmth beneath his skin, a dull ache spreading outward, a sense of heaviness lingering in his limbs. But then come the sharper signs, the ones that prick fear even into a king who has learned to endure almost anything. His fever spikes more frequently, his vision blurs unexpectedly, his heart races and then slows without explanation. He feels a strange pounding beneath the damaged tissue, a pulsing that feels unnatural, as though something inside him is expanding, stretching, pressing against the limits of what his body can contain. He knows what this means, knows it with the grim certainty of a man who has lived long enough with suffering to interpret every sign his body gives. And still, he refuses to surrender. Instead, he holds on to consciousness with the same stubborn grit that carried him through battles he could not ride into, negotiations he could barely sit through, and nights when he felt his own flesh dying beneath him. He continues to think, to plan, to speak with clarity even when pain claws up his spine, carving through his nerves like a blade drawn slow. He continues to rule not in spite of his suffering, but alongside it. The two knitted together so tightly now that they are indistinguishable. The king has become something that transcends ordinary endurance. A figure shaped not by war or triumph, but by the daily battle waged within his own body. And as this chapter of his story settles into place, it becomes clear that the kingdom is no longer merely led by a man. It is being held together by sheer force of will, by the unbroken mind of a king whose flesh may be rotting but whose resolve remains as solid as the stone foundations beneath his throne. By the time the next stretch of Alfred's life takes shape, the boundary between his body and his duty has become so blurred that even he can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. And the throne room feels less like a place he governs from, and more like the core of a storm tightening around him with every passing day. The walls that once echoed with firm voices and the firm scratch of quills now hold an atmosphere so dense that anyone stepping inside feels it immediately. A heavy mixture of illness, determination, and something quieter beneath it all. An unspoken acknowledgement that their king is not only fighting the world outside, but waging a private war inside his own flesh. Alfred senses the shift in others long before he admits it to himself, noticing how their eyes linger on him a little too long, how their voices soften when they speak, how everyone moves, with a care that suggests they fear the slightest shock might shatter him like a cracked vase under too much pressure. Yet in the strange way, suffering reshapes a man. He also absorbs this attention and converts it into a form of resolve that keeps him upright long after his body begs him to collapse. The infection simmering beneath his skin grows bolder in this period, creeping through him with a heat that comes and goes like a tide pulled by the moon, sometimes leaving him drenched in sweat, other times shaking with cold so violent his teeth chatter until he tastes blood. These fevers arrive unannounced, climbing up his spine like flames licking a dry beam, twisting his breath into shallow gasps. But Alfred does not allow the kingdom to see these moments. He forces his posture straight, breathes through clenched teeth, and waits for the fever to recede before calling his counselors back into the room. There are long stretches when he wonders whether his mind might slip from him entirely. When the room tilts so sharply, he has to grip the throne just to keep from sliding sideways. When whispers seem to echo around him, even though no one speaks. But those moments pass like storms. leaving behind a strange clarity, sharper and clearer than before. It is as if every fever burns away a layer of weakness, leaving his thoughts carved into something hard and crystalline, honed by the fire of his suffering. What surprises him most in this phase is how deeply he begins to reflect on the body that has turned against him. Before the illness consumed his life, he never thought much about flesh or bone or the strange machinery that keeps a man standing, breathing, thinking. But now he feels every part of his body with startling precision, knowing which muscles tighten when he shifts on the throne, which veins pulse in protest when the swelling grows worse, which nerves ignite first when a new wave of pain arrives. His body has become a map he knows too well, a landscape of scar tissue, secret X, and hollow spaces where strength used to live. And although he hates the betrayal happening inside him, he also marvels at the fact that he still moves, still speaks, still exerts his will over a kingdom, even as his own flesh deteriorates hour by hour. In a dark way, the pain becomes proof of his existence, a reminder that he is still here, still battling. Even as parts of him wither, the people closest to him continue to evolve in response to his suffering, their lives bending in strange arcs around the throne. The servants who tend to him have lost the last shreds of their initial discomfort. Now they move with a weary intimacy born only from repetition and necessity. Their hands no longer tremble when handling the chamber pot. Their faces remain composed even when blood flows more heavily than usual. And yet, beneath their composure, Alfred senses an exhaustion that mirrors his own, a shared toll that binds them in an unspoken fraternity of survival. Sometimes he catches their eyes for a split second as they kneel beneath him. And in those moments he sees something almost tender in their expression, a quiet pain at witnessing his suffering, but also a fierce loyalty to the man who endures it. They are not mere attendants anymore. They have become the silent backbone of his endurance, the ones who keep him physically functioning so his mind can continue leading the kingdom. His counselors, too, carry the burden in ways they do not speak of. Some visit the throne room with an unease that borders on dread, fearing each time that they might find the king slumped over, finally overtaken by infection. Others enter with determined expressions, their loyalty deepening precisely because of what they witness. And though Alfred never asks for pity or admiration, he can feel the weight of their devotion settling onto his shoulders like another cloak. It is both comforting and suffocating. He understands that his suffering has become a kind of rallying point, a symbol of perseverance, a strange proof that leadership is not defined by strength of body, but by strength of spirit. But he also knows that symbols are fragile, and that one day the infection inside him will reach a point beyond endurance, and all their hope will crumble the moment he finally falls. Even the physical world around him seems to respond to his weakening state. The air in the throne room grows more humid, carrying the smell of herbs that must be replaced more often now, of poultices applied more frequently, of decay that deepens with each passing week. The wooden floorboards near his throne darken from years of spilled disinfectant and splashes of blood, too faint for cleaners to fully remove. The cushions on the throne are replaced again and again, each new set lasting a little shorter than the one before. The walls absorb everything, the whispers, the groans, the fugitive moments of raw agony. The room becomes a living archive of suffering, a space where time thickens and memory deepens until the very air feels saturated with echoes of the king's pain. Through all of this, the outside world remains relentless, pulling at Alfred with an urgency that does not care about his wounds. There are legal disputes to settle, raids to analyze, alliances to negotiate, letters to write and review. And though he moves slower now, his breath shorter, his voice occasionally strained, his mind remains lethal in its precision. Sometimes he surprises himself with the sharpness of his thoughts. How quickly he can cut through arguments and suggestions to reach the root of a problem. Pain has forced him into a discipline more exacting than any teacher could have imposed, granting him a focus that borders on unnatural. His mind is the one part of him untouched by rot, and it becomes the kingdom's greatest weapon, guiding them through crisis after crisis. Even as his body becomes a battlefield, he loses ground on each day. But private life, the part of kingship rarely recorded in chronicles, becomes increasingly unbearable. Alfred no longer eats with his family. He no longer walks the castle grounds. He no longer visits the chapel, except in moments of extreme resolve, carried by attendants who hold him upright, while he prays through clenched teeth. His wife, Ilswith, tries to hide her worry, but Alfred sees it in her eyes. Each time she enters the room, their conversations soften as time goes on, drifting into gentler topics, not because they lack deeper matters to discuss, but because neither wants to acknowledge how drastically their world has narrowed. She smells the decay even through the incense. She sees the tremors Alfred tries to hide, and though she never speaks of it, he knows. She fears waking one morning to news that her husband has died in the night. Seated on the throne he could never leave behind. During the quietest hours, when the burden of kingdom and body both settle heavily upon him, Alfred confronts the frightening reality that his suffering is no longer a cycle but a progression. A slow, steady descent toward an end that draws closer with each fever, each pulse of swelling tissue, each throb that spreads across him like a bruise blooming under the skin. He knows what is happening. He can feel it. Yet he continues to sit, continues to rule, continues to hold together a kingdom with nothing but the force of his own will. And as this phase of his story quiets into its final notes, one truth becomes clear. He is not merely a king enduring illness, but a man fighting a war inside his flesh, while leading another outside his walls. A man whose suffering has become the strange engine of his resilience, and whose body is slowly becoming the very battlefield upon which his final legacy will be written. By the time the next long stretch of Alfred's story unfurls, his existence has narrowed into something almost ritualistic, as though every day is carved from the same block of suffering, yet somehow grows heavier with each passing hour. And the throne that once symbolized his authority now feels like an anchor keeping him from drifting into the darkness his body threatens to pull him toward. The infection festering inside him spreads its influence with a slow, methodical patience, tightening its grip like ivy creeping around old stone. And Alfred finds himself living in a strange twilight of half pain and half exhaustion where time seems suspended. His hours measured not in accomplishments or conversations, but in the spacing between waves of pain that radiate up his spine. His senses grow sharper in some ways and duller in others. He hears the soft scuff of footsteps from a hallway away, yet sometimes fails to register the trembling of his own hands until he sees them shaking in the corner of his vision. The human body adapts to suffering in ways both miraculous and monstrous, and Alfred feels himself becoming something forged by agony, shaped by the relentless pounding of his own weakening flesh. This period is marked by an increasing number of moments in which his mind begins drifting beyond the confines of the room, slipping into strange pockets of memory and imagination that rise unbidden. Sometimes, in the middle of a council meeting, his attention fractures, and he finds himself recalling childhood scenes running barefoot through fields, hearing the distant echo of knights practicing in the courtyard, tasting bread still warm from the oven. The memories are so vivid that he can almost smell the grass crushed beneath his feet. And then another pulse of pain jerks him back into the present, where the room feels smaller and more suffocating than ever. At other times, he drifts into what feels like visions, imagining himself standing on a cliff overlooking a roaring sea, the wind pushing against him with a force that makes him feel alive, despite the weight of decay dragging him down. These visions frighten him when he finally rouses from them, though he does not speak of them to anyone, because he fears that if he acknowledges how far his mind wanders, someone may interpret it as a sign of collapse, rather than a coping mechanism for agony that never eases. His servants notice these moments, even though he tries to conceal them. They see the way his gaze slips past the faces in the room, lingering on a point far beyond the walls, and they wait quietly until he returns to himself. They understand more than he wishes they did, their roles transforming gradually into something between caretaker and witness. They no longer merely tend to his body, they keep track of his drifting mind, guiding him gently back to the present with a cough or a soft clearing of the throat whenever he seems lost too long. And though the dynamics remain deeply hierarchical on the surface, Alfred increasingly feels a strange brotherhood growing between them, an intimacy born not of choice, but of survival. These men and women, who once avoided meeting his gaze to preserve his dignity, now feel like the only people in the world who truly understand the magnitude of his suffering. They are the ones who see him when the pain strips him of every royal veneer, the ones who hold steady hands under him when he shakes too violently to stay upright alone. The counselors, by contrast, still cling to the illusions of formality and grandeur, but even they cannot deny the visible signs of deterioration. Alfred's skin takes on a pallor that no amount of candlelight can disguise, and deep lines form around his eyes from the constant clenching of muscles during pain. His voice sometimes cracks unexpectedly, the strain of speaking layered upon the strain of simply existing, and moments come when he must pause mid-decree to wait for the pain to recede, enough for him to finish the sentence. Yet, despite this visible decay, the clarity of his thoughts remains astonishing. He makes decisions that surprise even the most seasoned advisors, cutting through complexities with a precision that seems at odds with the trembling of his hands. Some counselors whisper privately that the king's suffering has sharpened his mind the way fire sharpens steel, burning away any softness or hesitation. Others wonder whether he is pushing himself too far, fearing that one day he will collapse mid-sentence and never rise again. But none of them dare voice their concerns aloud, because they know he would reject pity with a quiet ferocity more dangerous than anger. What becomes inevitable during these months is the king's retreat from the world beyond the chamber. He no longer walks the corridors or appears on balconies to greet the people. Even short journeys from the throne become ordeals that leave him panting, sweat pouring down his face, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. He sits more than ever now, not out of choice, but because standing has become a luxury his body no longer permits. The modified throne, once an accommodation, now feels like the only place his body can exist without immediate collapse. The servants discreetly add more cushions, restuffing them weekly, adjusting angles with such expertise that Alfred sometimes wonders whether they know the contours of his pain better than he does. Yet no matter how they adjust it, the pain always returns, a constant companion, humming beneath his skin like a low, unending vibration. The palace begins to shift around him in subtle ways. The corridor leading to his chamber grows quieter, as though the building itself has learned to tiptoe. No one laughs loudly near his room anymore. Even conversations conducted in hushed tones seem to fade quickly, swallowed by an atmosphere thick with anticipation and dread. The people of the court move with an awareness that something monumental is happening behind the closed door, something too fragile to disturb. Some are frightened by it, others fascinated, but all feel the gravity of it pulling at their thoughts. They sense that the king is nearing a threshold of illness, of time, of destiny, and no one knows what will greet him on the other side. Despite everything collapsing around him, Alfred's interior world grows paradoxically richer. He reads more than he ever did before, dictating translations and revisions with an intensity that makes scribes scramble to keep up. In these acts of creation, he finds a strange freedom, a place where his body cannot follow, where his mind can roam through ideas and possibilities untouched by decay. He writes of wisdom, of virtue, of suffering and perseverance, perhaps not fully realizing that future generations will read these works without ever grasping the agony that carved the words into being. He is aware, however, that his time is shortening. He feels it in the new depths of pain that surge without warning, in the heat that gathers beneath his skin like embers waiting to ignite, in the heaviness of his breath that makes even speaking feel like wading through mud. In the rare, quiet moments when he allows himself honesty, Alfred acknowledges that death no longer feels abstract. It feels close, familiar, like a figure waiting in the corner of the room with infinite patience. And yet he does not meet it with despair. Instead, he feels a strange mixture of defiance and acceptance. He wants to finish his work. He wants to leave behind something greater than the broken flesh consuming him. He wants the kingdom to stand after he falls. So he keeps speaking, keeps ruling, keeps breathing through the pain even when the air tastes like iron. And as this chapter settles into its final echo, one truth becomes unmistakable. Alfred is no longer merely surviving his condition. He is transcending it, holding his collapsing body upright through the force of will alone, shaping the future from a throne designed not for glory, but for endurance. He continues to live in defiance of the flesh that betrays him, and that defiance becomes the quiet, haunting heartbeat of his reign. By the time the next quiet, heavy chapter of Alfred's decline unfolds, the throne room has become less a place of governance and more a dim, pulsating cocoon where time thickens, where light bends softly around the outline of a man who is somehow both king and prisoner, and where every breath feels like it carries the weight of an entire kingdom, trembling in anticipation of what might come next. The infection smoldering inside him no longer behaves like a rebellious guest, but like a resident force claiming territory, creeping into places he cannot see, rising behind his ribs like phantom fire, settling deep within the folds of damaged flesh that now seem permanently swollen, permanently raw, permanently on the verge of tearing open. There are moments when Alfred imagines he can hear it, that slow internal rotting, a faint wet crackle beneath his skin that makes him shudder, not from fear but from a grief, so old and tired that even sorrow has lost its edges. Yet amidst all this decay, he continues to hold himself upright with a discipline so absolute, it becomes nearly unnatural. The posture of a man refusing to offer his enemy, the enemy within anything more than a clenched jaw and steady voice. His days now stretch into long, blurred hours in which he feels less like he is moving through time and more like time is moving through him, passing across his skin like the touch of cold water running down stone. He answers questions, signs decree, dictate letters, but increasingly these acts feel distant, as though performed underwater, his voice traveling through layers of thickness before reaching the ears of those around him. He registers their responses slowly, watching their mouths move with odd detachment, feeling his thoughts lag behind like a lantern carried through fog. Yet the moment clarity returns, which it always does. Sharp and sudden, it strikes with the force of lightning, illuminating every detail of a problem with merciless precision. These flashes of lucidity confuse his counselors, who struggle to reconcile the king, slumped in pain moments earlier, with the man whose mind cuts through their debates like a polished blade. The contrast grows more jarring by the day, and the men who once doubted him now stare at him with a mixture of awe and dread, wondering how long a body can endure while sustaining a mind burning so fiercely. The nights, however, are becoming their own kind of torment. Alfred sleeps only in scattered fragments, small, fragile pockets of unconsciousness that last minutes instead of hours. He wakes again and again to a bloom of pain radiating through him, expanding outward like ripples across dark water, each wave stronger than the one before. Sometimes he opens his eyes to find the chamber still, the torches burning low, the shadows thick and unmoving, and he feels a strange sense of being watched, not by people, but by the suffering that has settled into every corner of the room. It feels almost tangible now. A presence coiled beneath the throne, hovering in the corners, drifting around his shoulders like cold mist. On certain nights when the fever is worst, he imagines the shadows shift slightly, like silhouettes rising to greet him, dark figures formed from the echo of his own gasps, his own groans, his own whispered pleas. He knows it is the fever playing tricks. He knows his mind is fraying at the edges. And yet the visions never disappear quickly enough for him to dismiss them as illusions entirely. Lingering like bruises across his thoughts, long after dawn begins to seep through the cracks around the shuttered windows. But the most unsettling change during this period comes not from Alfred's mind but from his body. The pain has acquired a new character, no longer sharp and immediate but deep, saturated, heavy, as though the infection has settled into his bones themselves. Each attempt at shifting his weight feels like dragging a wounded limb through broken glass. At times he feels heat radiating from wounds he cannot reach, a throbbing burn that makes him clench the arms of the throne until the wood creaks beneath his grip. He feels moments of dizziness so intense, the entire chamber sways, the torches elongating into blurs of orange light as though melting. And though he refuses to say it aloud, he knows his strength is waning in ways he cannot fight. Food is fainter now. Like ash, water has become difficult to swallow. Even the air sometimes feels thick, as though trying to resist entry into his lungs, and he must inhale deeply to keep from suffocating on nothing but breath. The servants sense these changes long before the councillors do. Their hands brush his skin as they adjust cushions and place cloths beneath him, and they feel the new heat radiating from his flesh, the tremors running through him with greater frequency. Their eyes follow him with quiet worry, but he avoids meeting their gaze because he cannot bear to acknowledge their concern. It feels too intimate, too exposing, too close to the truth he is trying to hold back. Yet in ways he never intended, these servants become the compass by which he measures how close he is to breaking. When they move more quickly, he knows the bleeding is worse. When they linger near him longer than necessary, he knows his breathing has changed. When their hands tremble even slightly, he knows the infection has deepened. They say nothing, but their silence has grown heavier, and though they try to hide it, he feels the grief building in them like pressure behind a dam. The councillors eventually sense it too, though none dare give voice to their suspicions. They study the king more carefully now, watching the way he leans slightly to one side, as though sparing a part of his flesh from pressure. The way he sighs only when he thinks no one can hear. The way he holds his breath every time he shifts forward, waiting to see whether the pain will allow him to speak. Their meetings grow quieter, their debates shorten, their arguments dissolve faster than before. This is not respect, nor fear of punishment. It is something closer to reverence, a subdued awe at witnessing a man fight through suffering so immense it has reshaped the very atmosphere around him. And though they do not speak of it, each of them begins to understand that they are witnessing the slow erosion of a king's body in real time. A dissolution happening so gradually, and yet so relentlessly that they cannot help but feel the tightening grip of inevitability. Outside the walls, the kingdom moves forward, unaware of the intimate horror unfolding in the dimly lit chamber. Decisions flow from Alfred's throne with the same authority as ever, because he refuses to allow his suffering to seep into matters of state. He signs decrees with a steady hand even when his vision swims. He dictates battle strategies in a calm voice, even as the infection pulses hot beneath him. He instructs scribes on translations with sharp precision, even when he feels sweat running down his back in cold. Feverish lines. His determination grows almost frightening, a kind of relentless purpose that refuses to yield to the rot consuming him. It becomes his shield and his defiance, and his last remaining tether to the man he once was, anchoring him, even as he feels the boundaries of his endurance fraying thread by thread. And yet, amid all this strength, there are private moments that no one but the shadows witness when Alfred feels himself slipping. He feels the weight of exhaustion sink into his bones until he wonders whether he could even stand if he tried. He feels a chill settling into his spine that no blanket can warm. He feels his thoughts beginning to scatter like dry leaves in sudden wind. He closes his eyes and imagines what it might feel like to simply let go, to release the ceaseless tension in his muscles, to stop fighting the decay that has wrapped itself around him like a vine. But every time he approaches that threshold, something pulls him back. Duty, memory, stubbornness, faith, or perhaps all of them woven together into a single thread strong enough to hold him one more day. And so he continues to breathe, continues to rule, continues to endure a pain so vast it has become a landscape of its own. By the time this next chapter unfolds, Alfred's world has collapsed into a narrow corridor of existence, bordered on all sides by pain, fever, and the dimming light of a body that can no longer keep pace with the iron will that drives it forward. The throne room, once merely oppressive, now feels like a sealed chamber suspended outside of ordinary life, a place where time folds over itself and hours stretch into something thick and slow, where even sound seems to press down with weight. The torches burn lower these days, not because they lack fuel, but because the air feels too heavy for flame to rise fully, as if even fire hesitates in the presence of so much suffering. Alfred sits in the center of this dim world, with the posture of a man clinging to the last remnants of strength, his hands gripping the carved wooden arms of his throne, while the fever inside him surges and recedes like a tide governed by some cruel lunar pull he cannot resist. The infection that has been creeping through him for years has finally begun to reveal its true nature. There are moments now when Alfred feels a deep, sickening pressure inside him, as though something swollen and festering has grown beyond its capacity to be contained, and he imagines the damaged flesh beneath him, straining like old fabric stretched too tightly over a jagged frame. The pain moves differently now. It no longer strikes in sharp bursts, but throbs through him like waves rolling in slow succession, each one heavier and more suffocating than the last. At times he feels heat radiating from places he cannot touch, a spreading fever that crawls outward with a thick, oily sensation that makes him shiver in bursts so violent he nearly slides off the throne. Other times he feels cold seep into him from the floor upward, a chill so deep he fears it may be the first touch of death reaching for him, tugging gently at his bones. Sleep has abandoned him almost entirely, leaving behind only thin skeins of unconsciousness that drift over him, then disappear just as quickly. Offering no relief, he wakes often with a strangled sound in his throat, sweat slicking his hair to his temples while the room tilts and sways. His breath comes shallow and uneven, each inhale carrying a faint metallic taste that clings to his tongue like a smear of iron. Many nights he opens his eyes to the hazy glow of torches and feels completely detached from the world around him, as though he is floating just above his own body, watching himself from a distance, with the eerie detachment of a ghost haunting its own living form. In those moments, the throne seems less like a seat and more like an altar where he is slowly being offered up, piece by piece, to a pain that does not tire or relent. The servants closest to him feel the shift in ways that haunt them more deeply than they will ever admit. Their hands tremble now when they adjust the cushions, not from fear of punishment, but from a helplessness so profound it sinks into their bones. They see the way Alfred's skin has taken on a thin, translucent quality, stretched tightly over cheekbones that have grown sharper with each passing week. They see the hollow ache in his eyes, the way his lips go pale whenever he tries to speak through the rising heat of infection, and yet he still insists on dignity, on structure, on the rhythms of rule. He still calls for documents, still gives orders, still engages in the work of shaping a kingdom, even as his breath shakes and his vision blurs at the edges. The servants, bound to silence by duty and loyalty, move around him with increasing reverence, aware that they are witnessing a battle far more brutal than any fought on open fields. The councillors, too, have changed in their presence and demeanour. They lower their voices instinctively when they enter the room, not out of decorum, but because the chamber feels like a place where loud sound might shatter something fragile. They speak slowly, choosing their words with care, their eyes flicking toward the king's trembling hands or fever-bright gaze before quickly looking away. Even those once hardened by years of war and politics feel discomfort settle into their chests when Alfred struggles to sit upright long enough to sign his name on decrees. There are moments when he must pause, mid-discussion, pressing a hand to his abdomen as though trying to calm the storm beneath his flesh, and the councillors wait with a kind of collective breath-holding, afraid that pushing forward might break him. But every time, Alfred lifts his gaze and continues as though nothing happened. And this quiet defiance unsettles them more than any display of weakness could. What becomes most evident during this period is the way Alfred has begun to experience time, not as a series of days or hours, but as a chain of painful intervals. Every decision, every sentence he speaks, every thought he shapes is measured in the space between pain. He becomes adept at working in bursts, focusing intensely during brief moments of clarity, pushing through exhaustion with a discipline that verges on superhuman. And though his body betrays him more cruelly with each passing day, his mind remains a force untouched, a flame flickering with eerie steadiness, even as the wax melts rapidly beneath it. This mental sharpness is both his salvation and his curse, for it allows him to continue ruling effectively, while also forcing him to remain painfully aware of his own decline. As the days pass, the palace shifts from anxious anticipation to something closer to resigned tremor. Every servant who walks past the throne room pauses for a heartbeat, listening for signs of movement inside. Every advisor steels themselves before entering, uncertain whether the king will be seated in his usual posture of strained endurance or slumped forward, consumed by fever, and though no one speaks it aloud, the entire court feels the tightening coil of inevitability winding around the king's fate. The air grows heavier with each whispered rumour, each flicker of torchlight that casts two long shadows against the walls, each quiet groan that escapes the king's lips when he thinks himself unobserved. Yet despite all of this, despite the spreading infection, the endless pain, the nights haunted by visions and half-sleep, Alfred retains one quality that terrifies. Even those loyal to him, he refuses to surrender. When his fever dims for even a moment, he demands to be briefed on matters of the kingdom. When his breathing steadies for a few minutes, he dictates letters or reviews manuscripts. When his mind clears unexpectedly, he analyzes battle reports with the same cold accuracy he once displayed in youth. His determination feels less like human willpower and more like something carved from stone, something immovable, something that belongs to legend rather than flesh. And it is this unyielding fire burning inside a body that has long since begun collapsing that creates a contradiction so heartbreaking it almost defies comprehension. Alfred is rotting, horribly, visibly, painfully, but he is also ruling with such brilliance and clarity that no one can imagine leading the kingdom without him. His body is failing, but his mind stands tall. His flesh decays, but his will grows even stronger, as though each piece of him that falls away sharpens whatever remains. And as this chapter settles into its slow, trembling close, one truth hums beneath every beat of his failing heart. Alfred is nearing the edge. The infection is no longer a question of if, but when. His suffering has become the silent clock counting down his final days. And yet even in this shadowed state, he continues to hold the kingdom together with threadbare hands and an unbreakable spirit, refusing to crumble until the very last breath. By the time this next chapter drifts into being, the line between Alfred's life and his slow undoing has nearly dissolved, leaving him in a space where existence feels more like endurance than living, where every breath is a negotiation and every heartbeat lands with the weight of something borrowed rather than owned. The throne beneath him has grown warm from his fevered body, the wood absorbing years of pain until it seems to pulse faintly under his hands like a living thing. And the chamber around him feels smaller now, as though the walls themselves have crept inward in quiet increments, compressing the world into a tight circle where only he, his suffering, and the flickering light of the torches remain. The air hangs thick with the scent of herbs and decay, an aroma so deeply woven into the stone that even fresh bundles of lavender and rosemary cannot smother it. Alfred breathes it in because he has no choice, the smell becoming as familiar to him as the rhythm of his own thoughts. And though it turns the stomachs of those who enter the room, he barely registers it anymore. It is simply the air his life has become. The infection inside him advances with a steadiness that terrifies even the most composed attendants, creeping through his bloodstream like ink, spreading across cloth, darkening everything it touches. His fever no longer comes in waves, but lingers constantly, a heat that makes his skin glisten, and his breaths come quick and shallow. He feels it burning beneath his ribs, behind his eyes, in the tender, swollen tissue beneath him that throbs with each passing hour as though trying to beat its own frantic, grotesque rhythm. At moments he feels dizzy enough to believe he might slip out of consciousness entirely, drifting off the edge of his awareness like a feather caught in a breeze. But somehow the pain always drags him back before he can fall too far. The pain is the anchor, keeping him tethered to the world, the one thing that refuses to release him to rest. And though he despises its cruelty, the part of him knows that without it, he might drift away and never return. His vision has begun to blur at odd intervals, the edges of the room swimming as though submerged underwater. Sometimes he sees two versions of the same figure standing before him, their forms sliding apart like shadows, struggling to reconverge, and he must blink slowly several times before the world settles back into its single trembling outline. Other times he sees nothing at all, just a bright whiteness washing over his sight, a sudden blind flash that leaves him momentarily suspended in a silent void, where the only sensation is the throbbing pulse of his wounds vibrating through his bones. These episodes strike without warning, leaving him disoriented and breathless, clutching the arms of his throne until the world reassembles itself around him. Each time it takes longer for his mind to catch up, longer to remember where he is, who he is, why he must keep sitting, breathing, ruling. The servants closest to him whisper among themselves in the corridor, though their voices are barely audible, like drifting threads of silk brushing against stone. They move more cautiously now, aware that even the slightest disturbance might send a jolt of agony through the king's trembling frame. Their eyes have grown red from lack of sleep, for they rise with him through the long nights, tending to him as he shifts and groans and fights to steady himself when waves of fever strip away his composure. They wipe his brow. They clean the throne's basin. They change the cloths under him with hands that tremble, not from fear of him, but from the dread of watching a man they have served for years deteriorate before their eyes. And though they never speak of it, they sense that something in the king's spirit has begun to loosen, as though part of him has already stepped past the threshold, separating the dying from the living. His counselors now arrive somber and heavy-shouldered, their voices quiet, their movements cautious, their expressions somber, with the knowledge that the king before them is fading. They watch him struggle to lift his head, watch him inhale deeply before speaking, watch him steady himself with a slow, deliberate motion that betrays how close he is to collapse. Yet when he speaks, his words remain sharp, woven with the same clarity and authority that has guided them through years of crisis. It is the contrast that shatters them, the body crumbling like dried bark and the mind still blazing with purpose. Some leave his chamber with eyes burning, unable to reconcile the hero they serve with the suffering man hunched before them. Others leave in silence, struck dumb by the realization that history, real history, is being shaped by a man who can barely stay upright but refuses to stop thinking, planning, commanding. The room itself has grown more oppressive, a place saturated with the residue of years spent battling an unseen enemy. The floors are scrubbed daily, yet still carry faint stains that the wood refuses to relinquish. Marks of blood and medicine, and the quiet tragedies of his condition. The walls hold the muffled echoes of nights when Alfred gasped in the throes of fever or whispered prayers in a voice so fragile it barely existed at all. Even the light feels dimmer now, the flames flickering with a strange hesitance, as though the fire itself feels sorrow. Sometimes the torches sputter unexpectedly, plunging the room into momentary gloom. And in those seconds, Alfred feels a chill, deeper than any fever could cause, a sense that the light in his life is beginning to tremble, that his presence in this world flickers the way the flame does, dancing on a wick nearly burned out. The infection soon begins to reveal new horrors. Swelling intensifies, heat gathers beneath his skin, and moments arise when he feels something wet and warm seeping from him in greater amounts than before. There are mornings when the servants must change the cloths under him repeatedly, their faces drained of colour as they work in strained silence. Alfred senses their distress but lacks the strength to address it. He can only close his eyes and endure as a wave of nausea sweeps over him. His body has become unsteady, unpredictable, a vessel leaking from its wounds, and the knowledge of this fills him with a profound, private sorrow. He has lived through battles with steel and fire. Now he is losing a war against his own blood, and yet he continues. Somehow, impossibly, he continues. His voice breaks sometimes when he speaks, but he still speaks. His hand trembles when he lifts the quill, but he still signs. His lungs ache as he breathes, but he still breathes. And every time a counselor kneels before him, every time a servant holds a cloth soaked in herbs beneath him, every time a messenger bows low and delivers news of the kingdom, Alfred straightens his spine as much as his body will allow and meets their eyes with the steady gaze of a man who refuses to surrender, even as he stands inches from the edge. As this chapter coils toward its end, a quiet, unshakable truth settles over the room like a descending veil. Alfred is dying. Not quickly, not mercifully, but inch by inch, cell by cell, in a slow, relentless unraveling that no medicine or prayer can halt. And though the kingdom outside still moves, still fights, still hopes, the heart of that kingdom beats here, in this dim chamber, inside the trembling frame of a king who has given everything, his body, his strength, his pride, to keep his people alive. By the time the final chapter of Alfred's life begins to seep into being, the throne room has transformed into a sacred, sorrow-soaked hollow where every shadow feels like an omen, and every flicker of torchlight bends gently toward the man who has endured far beyond what flesh was ever designed to bear. The air inside no longer simply feels heavy, it feels ancient, as though it has witnessed centuries instead of days, thick with the scent of decay, lavender, and the cold, metallic whisper of impending death. The walls, once silent witnesses, now seem to breathe slowly with him, expanding and contracting as though trying to match the shallow rhythm of his weakening lungs. Alfred sits bowed slightly forward on the throne that has consumed years of his life, his hands resting loosely on its carved arms, his fingers barely able to close around the wood. And even though his eyes remain open, their light has dimmed into something soft and far away, as if his mind stands in the doorway between this world and whatever waits beyond it. His body has surrendered almost entirely. The infection that began years ago as a hidden wound has now claimed him fully, spreading like wildfire through his blood, settling into every joint, every muscle, every breath. The fever has melted his strength until his limbs feel as though they are filled with boiling sand, heavy and unresponsive. His skin has taken on a pale translucence, stretched thin over bones that jut sharply beneath it. And the once swollen tissue beneath him has deteriorated into a state so agonizing that the servants can no longer hide their horror when they clean him. Each touch they make is gentle, reverent, almost prayerful, as though tending to a relic more than a man. And they move with such care that even the sound of cloth against flesh seems softer than air. Alfred feels each touch like distant pressure, a muffled echo travelling through nerves that are too inflamed, too rough, too exhausted to respond properly. His breathing has changed too. It comes in short, trembling waves now. Each inhale shallow and unsteady, as though the air resists entering his lungs. Sometimes he pauses between breaths for so long that the servants standing behind him grow rigid, unsure whether they should rush forward or wait, whether this is the moment they have feared for so long. But each time, after an eternity compressed into a heartbeat, his chest rises again with a small, fractured sound that feels like a protest from a body desperate to remain in the world even as it slips away. These pauses become longer by the day, and though the room remains silent, a suffocating anticipation fills it like thick fog, wrapping itself around every person, every object, every breath that still manages to form. The councillors arrive less frequently now, and when they do, they enter the throne room with steps as slow as grief itself. They know the end is near, though none can bring themselves to say it aloud. Their voices are hushed, fragile, trembling on the edges of tears they refuse to shed in front of their king. They speak only when necessary, updating him on matters of the kingdom in short, gentle phrases, their words no longer wrapped in politics or contention, but stripped down to essential truths. Alfred listens with a stillness that breaks their hearts, nodding faintly when clarity reaches him, though sometimes they wonder whether he hears them at all, or simply recognizes their shapes through the haze clouding his vision. Yet even in these fading hours, when his sight blurs and the world drifts like smoke before him, there are moments when awareness flickers in his eyes like a dying flame, reigniting itself for one final glow. One such moment arrives when his eldest son enters the chamber. The boy, no longer a boy but a man shaped by war and responsibility, kneels before him, taking his father's trembling hand in both of his breasts. Alfred looks at him with a softness that seems almost impossible, given the pain etched into his every breath. A faint smile touches the corners of his mouth, small and fragile, but real. He speaks in a voice so thin it seems woven from cobwebs, telling his son that England must be held together not by strength, nor by fear, but by wisdom carved from suffering. His son listens, tears burning behind his eyes, and Alfred's words drift through the room like sacred echoes, reshaping themselves into memories even before they fade from his lips. The night that follows feels unlike any other. A strange quiet settles over the chamber. A quiet so profound it feels as though the entire world has paused in reverence. The torches burn lower than ever, their flames little more than trembling threads of light, swaying in rhythm with Alfred's faltering breaths. The servants gather around in respectful distance, forming a silent ring of witnesses whose faces are lined with grief and devotion. The air feels colder somehow, though no windows have been opened, as if a gentle wind invisible to all but the dying man has entered the room to carry him toward his final moments. Near dawn, Alfred's head tilts slightly forward, and his breathing becomes even shallower. The pauses between each inhale, stretching longer and longer until they feel like stretched threads ready to snap. He closes his eyes, perhaps to rest, perhaps to gather strength, perhaps because the world before him has grown too heavy to bear. For a long time, nothing happens. Minutes dissolve into one another like melting wax. The torchlight flickers across his skin, casting moving shadows that make him look almost peaceful, almost free from pain. And then finally, gently, quietly, without struggle, his chest rises one last time, trembles with effort, and falls, and does not rise again. The room remains frozen in silence. No one moves, no one breathes. The servants stare at the king, this man who ruled while rotting, who endured the unimaginable, who fought both enemies and his own failing body, and see not a figure of power, but a human being finally released from pain. The councillors who stand at the doorway bow their heads, unable to speak. His son steps forward and lowers his forehead to his father's cold hand, grief shaking through him in waves too deep for words. Outside, the world continues unaware, but inside this dim chamber, the end of an era settles like dust across stone. Later, when the body is lifted from the throne with reverent hands, when the room is cleaned and the throne removed, when the official story of his death is written with careful omissions and polished dignity, no record will capture the truth of how he lived his final years. No chronicle will describe the smell, the blood, the agony, the unwavering mind inside the deteriorating flesh. They will call him Alfred the Great. They will praise his wisdom, his leadership, his victories. But only this room and those who witnessed his suffering will ever know the full truth that his greatness was forged not in triumph, but in torment, and that he remained unbroken until the very moment his body gave out.